Our program today is entitled Los Altos Housing Element, What's Next? With Nick Zorns, Los Altos Development Services Director. We're thrilled to welcome Nick back to LACC. Nick has been an environmental planner with the Nebraska Department of Environmental Quality, helping build water infrastructure across the state, a planner for the city of Dana Point, California, a planner for the city of Encinitas, where he's part of the team that obtained the city's first certified housing element in over 2 decades, overcoming several land use challenges and regulatory barriers. Most recently, he was planning manager for Riverside County. Prior to his work in the public sector, Nick worked as a planning consultant and within the construction industry as a project manager. Please join me in welcoming Nick this morning.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I know a lot of familiar faces and I've met with some of you personally and most recently on some of the work that we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to kick off with a high-level just presentation that kind of covers what the housing element is, where we're at, and where we need to be. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen really quick.
And hold your questions if you have any. We'll do a few follow-ups after Nick's slides, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for Q&A around 9:15 today. Go ahead, Nick. We can see your next slide on the screen. Do you see that?
You guys don't see just the full picture slide?
No, we see like the presenter's view or whatever that's called.
All right, give me 1 second for technical difficulties, I guess.
Yeah, it's I think it's like you have to swap screens or something like that. There's always a challenge with this. Yeah. Actually, that looks good.
Just this way.
Well, I mean, it shows all the borders and things, but do you want to hit presentation and see what happens? Or I could try it on my side.
If you want to try it with the one that I sent you, Joe, just so it's full screen for people.
Okay, let me see if I can get that to work. If you could stop sharing, and then sorry for the technical difficulties, everybody. We've all been there. Let's see if this works.
Yep, that shows everything.
All right, just if you just tell me next slide, I'll flip through them for you.
Sure, sounds good. All right, so yeah, so this morning I'm going to again go over a high-level just overview of what the housing element actually is and where we're at. Some of this is going to seem fairly repetitive if I've talked to you in the last week or so, but that's because the same type of information sharing needs to get told in the consistent story of what our city's narrative is with what we're doing and how we're doing it. So next slide, Joe, and again, next. So I do just want to cover the high-level background overview of the housing element and what it is. A housing element is a part of a city's general plan. It is one of the required elements. It is required statutorily to be updated every 8 years. I will just at least touch on is that there used to be the requirement until last year's legislative cycle. There used to be the term mid-year cycle or a 4-year cycle. That no longer exists. All jurisdictions other than places like San Francisco and LA have an 8-year cycle. There is no 4-year turnaround. However, we do reevaluate the housing element at the midpoint of the cycle. So there is no longer a 4-year kind of what HCD used to apply as a penalty, where you would have to go through the housing element all over again fully if you were a non-compliant jurisdiction. So just so that some people understand that, and I can answer additional questions later if you have something about that, or email me and I'll feel free to give you more info. And lastly, just as I'm going to refer to them by the acronym of HCD, just so that everyone knows, it is the California Department of Housing and Community Development, which is essentially the state level of my department here at the city. However, their wheelhouse is predominantly to review and enforce housing law compliance with all of the 400 plus jurisdictions throughout California. Next slide, Joe. Main components, we've been talking about this throughout the entire housing element process. These are the seven main criteria that are required for a housing element. Housing needs assessment, your housing constraints, your existing programs, housing resources, site inventory and methodology, how we're going to affirmatively further fair housing and that overall assessment. And then really kind of what your roadmap and blueprint is what is going to be your goals, policies, and programs on how you're going to do what you need to do in your jurisdiction to accomplish your RHNA allocation. RHNA, you'll also hear me say throughout a presentation or whenever I'm talking about the housing element, is your regional housing needs assessment or allocation. That's kind of used interchangeably, but RHNA is an allocation from our county level of ABAG and the COG, which is the Council of Governments. Next slide, Joe. Thank you. So just high level, I'm not going to go down each of the four criteria. The city, I think everyone knows pretty well by now. Our allocation, although it is higher than in years past, it is lower than most other jurisdictions based on our size, as well as based on our build out that we already have present in town, as well as our location to transportation. Those are kind of three main points of what we actually, get assessed at for our allocation when it comes to RHNA at a, 100-foot level viewpoint. But there are a lot of other criteria that ends up getting factored into when you get your actual number of affordable units. Ours, for practical purposes, is just under 2,000 units, and that's broken across 4 income categories. Anything from very low income, moderate, and above moderate. I will just say one thing is that there is a need for another income category, which is considered extremely low. That is something that you're not assessed at as a requirement specifically to build as a part of your RHNA allocation. However, any extremely low affordable housing units that are built do get to count towards your RHNA allocation. So it is, it's not just a unit built, you do actually get to factor that in as unit built. So just so someone knows if you ever see that additional income category. Next slide. Just a high level talk about, I've reiterated this several times ever since July when we really started talking about our draft element and what inevitably went to the state in August. Our goals, policies, and programs. This is the meat and potatoes of the document in regards to what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. There is 5 main components. I'm going to read the bullet points just because some folks don't understand why we're putting timeframes. They don't understand why we're putting certain criteria and commitments. And it's because it's a part of the statutory requirement, inevitably. But it does, one of the 5 is timeframes for the implementation, which can be a sunrise and a sunset, depending on how you structure it. But inevitably, a lot of them do have some pretty heightened timelines within the first 1 to 3 years in order to actually accomplish those. Then we also need to identify the responsible agency or the officials within an agency. A small agency like ourselves, a lot of it is just going to say development services, because if you're in a bigger agency, such as like the County of Santa Clara, a lot of times certain programs will be developed and implemented maybe by a sub-agency in the organization, such as the Housing Authority might do the affirmatively furthering fair housing, and then the rezoning would be done by the Development Services Department at the county. So it just depends. But so predominantly you'll see in our element, it's going to be the Development Services Department. We need to describe the roles and responsibilities. That's something that's obviously very important, is if you have multiple different individuals that are participating in the program development, implementation, and evaluation, is who's going to actually do which part. Again, our jurisdiction, we're smaller, so it will inevitably pretty much fall onto development services for the majority of the roles and responsibilities. we do have to provide the measurable outcomes. So inevitably is what do we think as a jurisdiction that we're going to gain from the programs, policies, and goals that we're setting forth in our element. Some of them are fairly prescriptive with respects to what the statutory requirement is. So the measurable outcome is pretty specific as to what you pretty much can anticipate. However, that measurable outcome sometimes is more specific depending on exactly what you're trying to accomplish in your jurisdiction. And then obviously the last one is where are we identifying and providing the funding source from? Some things can be provided through grant opportunities. In 2019 and 2020, there was significant amount of non-competitive grants that were available. So a lot of jurisdictions were able to tap into those. Los Altos does already have its allocation for certain grant opportunities that were available during that time frame. But if there's any additional grants that we know about right now, it's kind of in the I would say quiet period of grant opportunities. So there's not going to be many grants that we're able to identify as a link of funding for the element going forward right now. However, in the future, is if there is anything, we can tap into that, and it can be kind of a moving scale of how we're funding it. Inevitably, our element identifies most of our funding sources as general fund. And just so that everyone understands is that all city staff is predominantly funded in development services by virtue of the general fund or by virtue of permit fees that are collected. So it actually makes sense is that the staff that we do use will also be doing a lot of the programs developments in the coming years for the housing element. So that's why the housing element will identify general fund as the main source. Next slide. So outreach completed. I want to touch on this just because I know that a lot of the community didn't understand what was written in HCD's letter, where some folks thought that we might not have completed a lot of or a sufficient amount of outreach. I do feel confident that our jurisdiction did do a significant amount. Obviously, you can always do more outreach. There's no end to that process, but something that I started iterating upon my arrival here and public discussions at the dais with the elected and appointed officials is that public outreach does not stop with the development and implementation and even just the presentation of a housing element. This is something that is a fundamental to not just the planning profession, but specifically to housing elements is the public engagement component of a housing element. And it's absolutely vital to what we do in regards to how we develop what we're going to do in the future. So leading up to the initial submittal is everything that's on this slide right now, which is a dedicated web page, multiple pop-up events, virtual small group meetings, multiple ads in the town crier, housing element newsletter, which has approximately 300 people signed up, community workshops, informational flyers sent direct mail, as well as banners around the cities to actually help folks know about the city dedicated website, as well as the number of just under 2,000 units and what we're doing with the housing elements to help people know where to go to find additional information. Next slide. And then I do just want to touch on, just because we did receive our housing element letter on November 10th. The following week, I met with the Los Altos Affordable Housing Alliance for a 2-hour meeting virtually. The following week, I met with a nonprofit called Dignity Moves. That nonprofit is doing temporary as well as permanent and supportive housing in neighboring jurisdictions such as Mountain View and Palo Alto. They do a lot of work throughout Silicon Valley as well as San Francisco proper. So that was really great to get some insight about what they think some things need to be integrated and tweaked in our housing element or in the coming years when we do our program development. Then as of last week, I met with the Chamber of Commerce and did a similar presentation that I'm giving today. And then today have quite an itinerary everyone has kind of joked around with me about. So this morning I'm meeting with the Los Altos Community Coalition, all of you folks that are logged in now. In a little few hours from right now, I'll be meeting with the Los Altos residents, or LAR. And then later this afternoon, I'll be meeting with the League of Women Voters. Just because obviously this is getting recorded, and folks might refer to this later. I do welcome community members and groups to reach out to further discuss the housing element. And obviously in the future, definitely program development and implementation, because that's the way that I always refer to in City Hall. A lot of people know this term is, I say it's a way for us to refine and define what we're doing. Refine it, perfect it, and then let's define it and move forward. So that's really kind of something that I really, if it's you as individuals that want to have further discussions, or folks that I need to reach out to, that's actually how I've talked to a couple of the groups that are on this screen between the 18th and today over the last month, is just by hearing some feedback of, hey, will you talk to this group of people? And I've reached out, and that's what I've done. So I definitely welcome that moving forward. Next slide. So just to also cover a high-level overview of where we're at in regards to the kind of critical dates of everything. On August 12th of this year, we did formally submit the housing element to HCD for its first review. The first review of a housing element is a 90-day review window. So it's a pretty big chunk of kind of radio silence, because the state is reviewing a big number of other housing elements right now. So they don't really kind of give you anything early on in the process. So it's really kind of a wait and see period. On October 26th, the city staff and consultant, as well as our assistant city attorney, Eric Ramakrishnan, met with HCD virtually just to discuss verbally some of the initial findings regarding the city's draft housing element. Obviously, if you do the simple math, that's only 2 weeks ahead of schedule from when we got our formal findings letter, which came in on the 90th day of the review. Typically, the preliminary review call with HCD happens 30 days in advance. We were not awarded that, nothing specific to our jurisdiction other than HCD staff being extremely inundated with other housing element reviews, having to get their statutory finding letters back out by the due dates. I also just want to cover one little comment for folks, just so that they understand why they are so inundated, is that the region that happens to be reviewed with their due date earlier this year, before the ABAG region, which is the Bay Area, is SCAG, which is the Southern California Association of Governments. So that COG is the largest in the state, with 250 jurisdictions in the SCAG region. So earlier this year, the state started receiving the formal adopted housing elements from 200 plus units or jurisdictions. And so they have been obviously trying to move forward with all of those reviews as well, now also receiving new reviews for the first time. So it's quite inundated, I can imagine, as I'm sure you can as well. So that's partly why I think we didn't receive any preliminary comments until 2 weeks prior to our formal letter. Next slide. So the housing element first review. So if any of the folks on the call were on the Zoom call or were in the chamber for our November 29th City Council study session, I covered a lot of what was in the HCD's findings letter in a regurgitation of it in a staff report, but with also an interpretation and kind of breaking it down into simple terms. HCD's letters, I will just be frank, is there's a lot of legal jargon in it in regards to that it is words and nomenclatures that are taken from our government code sections that are the foundations of what housing law is in California. Those particular letters sometimes are a little bit hard to ascertain unless you've done some housing elements before. So I kind of knew what I was expecting with a few of the comments, specifically like the public outreach comment. That was essentially kind of a standard language that they give to everyone, is that the buck doesn't stop here with your initial submittal. You need to continue to do outreach. You need to continue to reach and try to find whatever segments of the community that you can to be able to help further develop and, like I say, refine and define that housing element until it's as close to perfect as you can get it. And so the HCD's findings letter, what I like to really kind of refer it to as is our roadmap for each jurisdiction. That roadmap is essentially a way for us to say, hey, you have essentially your big bulk of the document and it's already completed, but here's how you need to continue to work, edit, and provide those revisions in order to be able to find or be found what's in their terms substantial compliance. Substantial compliance means that you are, predominantly meeting all of the statutory requirements and hitting your critical milestones for everything that will be outlaid or outlined in the housing law for the state. And that substantial compliance is something that's awarded to you when you are deemed to be found that way after you've made your revisions necessary. So that study session packet, I think, would be great if you haven't reviewed it or read it over. That also might be something great for everyone to reference, and you can find that on the city's website from the November 29th study session. Next slide. So next steps is we are going to revise the draft housing element. Obviously, that's kind of the process that we're in right now. Been working on that, obviously, for the, I guess, just over a month, but obviously some downtime has happened because of the holidays. But we're still obviously steadfast working on that as much as we possibly can to get that as perfected as possible, as well as obviously taking feedback and comments from the public now so that that can all be integrated into the document. So we are making, revisions to the draft housing element, which makes clear commitments to the actions necessary for the city to take on all of our prescribed programs, goals, and policies. From that revision, that gets shared with the public and posted on the website, shared with all the folks that are signed up on the newsletter for the housing element and that have requested by virtue of being on that newsletter to receive the revisions directly. But then we will be taking this document to the Planning Commission at the turn of the year in January, and then ultimately to the City Council for adoption. Next slide. Again, kind of critical dates. The 29th, we had a study session. The following day on the 30th, I released the MND, which is the Mitigative Negative Declaration for public review. This is the environmental document that is required, necessary for us to be able to do an amendment to a general plan. That comment period for the environmental document closes at the end of this month in 2 weeks from today. On January 5th, we will be going to the Planning Commission for a recommendation to the City Council. From there are two scheduled City Council dates, which is January 10th and January 24th, to give the potential for, if this item is not approved at the first meeting, that then it would go back to the second meeting in January for its final consideration. And then ultimately the statutory due date for the 6th cycle housing element for a jurisdiction in ABAG, which is the Bay Area Council of Governments, is January 31st, 2023. So we need to be doing all of our due diligence in order to adopt a housing element locally in our jurisdiction that is substantially compliant with housing law by January 31st to be found and to be in compliance. Next slide. So this is my favorite slide. I like to share this with jurisdictions. No matter where I'm at, this is essentially the same thing. It just changes the due date. So penalties for non-compliance. It's very important for us to make sure that we talk about this. If we are not to be found in substantial compliance within 120 days of our statutory due date, we would then have to rezone all of the properties in Los Altos that are identified in the housing element within 1 year of January 31st. So meaning that January 31st, 2024, all of our rezoning would have to be completed. If we were to be found in compliance within 120 days of the statutory due date, We then get 3 years to complete all of the rezones. And that's complete. So that means we're going to start working on all of the rezones pretty much, right after we're found to be in compliance, because it does take time to do any of the analysis, any of the outreach, because again, the buck doesn't stop with the adoption of the housing element. Every individual program requires public hearings, requires public input, and requires us to do the overall development, just as the processes we're taking right now for the overall document will have to come back. But it is very important for us to all be aware of the potential penalties for non-compliance. There is financial penalties. Courts can assess penalties to a housing element that is found to be in non-compliance. Obviously, there is legal suits, so litigation against the city for not being in compliant that can be taken by housing right organizations and developers, and even HCD themselves, which then would refer us to the Attorney General. Loss of state funding, so that means some of the state grants that hinge on you having an adopted and certified housing element, we would not be eligible for until we had that certified housing element. And then the big one, which is loss of permitting authority due to general plan inadequacy. This is a big one. A lot of people think that this is just the carrot that they dangle. This has actually been applied to jurisdictions, and you essentially do not have land use regulatory authority beyond just permitting things by right. So if it comes into a jurisdiction with an application and it meets the objective standards of the jurisdiction, it is permitted, essentially almost like as an over-the-counter type of a permit when it comes to planning. So it does really kind of take away the city's oversight and being able to apply some of the local desires of, how we want a building to be, kind of oriented, designed, function, certain things. So it is very important for us to also keep that in mind as well. Next slide. And that's it.
Great. Thank you. And let me get all this stuff back in order on my desktop here. So I just have a few questions for Nick, and then we'll open it up. First thing, Nick, I just want to say thank you on behalf of the residents. This is a huge undertaking. You kind of came in with this, partially started, I guess, and just it's not just through January 31st. This is going to be a multi-year, maybe a decade worth of effort. So thank you for everything you're doing right now. I know it's Los Altos is kind of a demanding group of residents who want to call you on your cell phone probably regularly and chat with you about this. So we appreciate what you're doing. So, I think we walked through the schedule a little bit, and it's kind of threading the needle with a series of meetings lined up in January to get us to that January 31st date. You talked a little bit about what happens if we don't meet that date. I think there's a cure period afterwards. Is that accurate, that 120 days afterwards to get things resolved if we don't make the January 31st deadline?
So that 120 days is a time period where if HCD sends us an additional letter saying, essentially, we disagree, you're not 100% done, here's your last 3 items, let's hypothetically say it that way. You need to modify them in this manner, and if you do so and essentially readopt and send us the readoption, then we will essentially, again, carrot, here's your substantial compliance. So it does give us a little bit of wiggle room, yes, in order to be able to make sure that we do our work and still then be eligible for the 3 years of rezoning.
Okay, great. And then I know you've had lots of conversations with residents, with council members, study sessions, group meetings. What do you think are the biggest misconceptions that people in Los Altos have regarding the housing element right now?
The biggest one, and it's why I have said it this way, is that the buck doesn't stop here with the housing element itself. Is all of these programs kind of identify the minimum of what exactly we're going to do. So, if it's a height increase for that program, okay, yep, we're going to increase the height, and this is what we're minimally going to do. If it's oh, we're going to rezone this property, okay, we're going to minimally rezone it to this amount of density. Doesn't mean that we can't play with the numbers a little bit once we have the program adopted and we're able to say, oh, yep, no, well, we also want to create this, alternative that if, let's say, hey, we're going to raise the height district or the height in a district by 10 feet. But we'll give you another 5 feet if you provide us an extra amount of affordable density. So it really is that we are going to continue to work on programs with the development in the future and kind of really craft what we want in the code so that we can apply it the way we want in Los Altos. But this is, again, our legal binding contract with the state saying, no, you will increase height. You will remove a barrier of density. If you have overly restrictive lot coverage requirements or, super big setbacks, you're going to reduce those down so that you don't have an impediment. So it's really kind of essentially helping to make sure that anything that has prevented development from occurring on a parcel, that you're creating the avenues for it to be able to be a viable project in the future. And so we have to obviously work with the community, and that means the residents, that means potential residents, that means the developers, really kind of looking and seeing exactly what it is that's going to get us across that finish line.
Okay, great. Thank you. There was the 10-page response from HCD, and I'm curious, what do you think are some of the most challenging changes or additions that they've requested?
Fundamentally, like I've said, and I'll continue to say it because it's something that all jurisdictions struggle with, is AFFH, which is affirmatively furthering fair housing. And that's because that is a newer requirement required under housing law. The housing law doesn't provide a lot of prescriptive methodology about how to achieve affirmatively furthering fair housing, because AFFH is different everywhere. It's dependent upon your demographics, your socioeconomics. It really is also, how your city kind of is laid out, how it functions, what areas and concentrations of, certain segments of the population are. So it's really something that you have to be very specific on in each jurisdiction in order to make sure that we are achieving AFFH for Los Altos. But like I said, every jurisdiction has that kind of challenge, I would say. I would also kind of just, really, I guess, probably emphasize is that, a lot of what we were provided comments for in the letter from HCD is, some of them are the blanket statements that are, for better or for worse, just kind of almost FYIs, that, hey, you have to continue doing outreach, or, oh, you need to include this as just as a blanket statement in your housing element. So some of them aren't as worrisome as I think maybe some folks that haven't seen some of these letters before. But I firmly do think that AFFH is probably just our one kind of bigger challenge, and that's with every jurisdiction.
Got it. And if I could just follow up on that, with regards to AFFH, do you feel like we've done enough there? Like, have we reached out to the restaurant workers, the cooks, the waiters, the grocery store clerks, the people who come to work in our community who may not be able to afford to live here? Do you feel like we've got enough programs or outreach to those organizations?
I think until this point, we've done as best as we can when it comes to the outreach component. I think that there's some of the things that we're going to revise in the document that allows us to strengthen our future and forthcoming programs. A lot of folks really do we need to have like a housing manager, for example, which is one of the things that we have in the housing element, to have that person that is able to be someone that goes out into the community and has the ongoing conversations and data collection, and then the overall analysis of exactly what we need fundamentally. And then that's the part with AFFH, it's an ongoing thing, where I think that's also one of the hard parts, is that a lot of folks think, oh, well, we just analyze it and then that's what we're going to do. Well, no, AFFH, it evolves, it changes over time, especially when you do find certain parts of the community that previously didn't want to be found or that were ignored and not found. So it needs to be an iterative process, because you do want to make sure that you're functionally achieving the needs of those segments as they are found and as the information is given. Because I think one of the great examples of something in regards to how AFH, sometimes the data component is collected or viewed, is very similar to the census. You know, how many times have we all over the years, each time the census comes around, oh, well, you know, what's your household income? And we all just say something different, because we just were like, well, we don't really want to give that to someone, or, oh, they don't give the right number of folks that live in the house. And so some of it also goes to that, is over time, those surveys evolve where the transparency and the information sharing changes the data. And so we have to reevaluate that and refine it and define it moving forward. So I think that's one of the biggest components of it, is that those programs are iterative and they have to be you know, evolutionary as we continue to move forward throughout the planning cycle. And that's inevitably what HCD expects of us, especially when we do what is called our APR, or the annual progress report. And that's something that is required every year in April for us to review what we've done over the last year, and then report out of, okay, are these programs working or not? It's a way for the state to have a checks and balance of us, but then it's also a way for the city to be like, oh, wait, that program's actually not working. We need to then reevaluate how we're doing it and what we're actually trying to achieve.
Great, thank you. So I want to go to questions in a moment. I just wanted to ask you, Nick, if you have any closing thoughts or remarks before we move on to audience questions.
Other than I honestly, I appreciate fundamentally all of the input that comes from the folks today, as well as, you know, when you guys reach out one-on-one via call and email. So definitely kind of keep your thoughts, ideas, and suggestions coming forward. But yeah, let's open it up, and I'll try to answer as many questions as we can this morning.
Great. And Nick, what's your deadline? You have to leave. Can we go a little over the 9:30?
Yeah, we can go a little bit over this morning. Yep.
Okay, I'll try and keep it to like 9:40 or so. I think we're going to have a lot of questions. So why don't we, if you could raise your virtual hands, and just remember, you know, one question per person, and you know, please don't make any speeches before you ask your question. So I see one hand, which is Janine.
Good morning. Sorry, my voice is a little weird. Thanks for coming, Nick. You're awesome. Love you. And my raison d'etre with the housing element is AFFH. So I was, you know, kind of understood when we handed in our housing element that this issue would come up. But my question to you is this. How, given the way Los Altos is laid out, and given the high amount of R1, you know, well over 90%, 95%, maybe higher, and given that our opportunities for, given that that's sacrosanct, which is one of my concerns, and therefore our higher density areas are very limited to, at this point, really one area, but through the housing element up to hopefully 3 areas. How can we possibly hope to meet the spirit as well as the letter of AFFH without touching R1?
the not touching of R1 is a fundamental decision that happened prior to me being here. And it's something that I think inevitably we in a midterm of the housing element for the planning cycle will need to evaluate, are we accomplishing not just the housing production, but also the spirit and intent of AFFH. At that point, that might be something that we then need to evaluate, integration into parts of the R1 potentially, if that's what we so choose to do at that time. I think it's an iterative process and a conversation. There are parts and components of the R1 that are inevitably going to change, and that's not by our housing element, but that's by virtue of state law with the ADUs. That has already started to change somewhat of the makeup of what individuals, refer to as the single family districts, but also, SB 9 with lot splits, as well as additional or higher density on single family lots. So it's something that I think, it's iterative. And I think as of right now, in the three main sections that are somewhat spatially spread out in town, south, mid, and then kind of the northerner side portion of what I'm referring to as ECR, is that then at the mid-year term or mid-year cycle of planning that we can look at it and say, okay, do we need to reevaluate integration into some of the other areas throughout our jurisdiction and kind of go from there.
All right. Thank you. We're going to move on to Brian. And if anyone else has a question, it's hard to get to the questions in the chat. So if those of you who ask questions in the chat could raise your hand and ask it, of Nick, that would be great. So Brian, go ahead.
Thanks. Nick, I think you said that our initial assessment was substantial compliance. Can you tell us, how much risk are we at to get penalized? And what do we need to make sure to do before the deadlines to make sure that those penalties don't apply? Sort of separate from how we want to move on going forward in the spirit of everything over the next 8 years.
Realistically, a lot of what was in our comment letter is things about essentially showing a little bit more data on probably 2 or 3 items, which the consultant team is working on that right now to make sure that we are providing additional data or analysis of the existing data. Obviously, you can't create data that doesn't exist. And a lot of jurisdictions, and I will tell you, so I have done 2 6 cycles prior to Los Altos 6 cycle. So I'm familiar with most jurisdictions from the 5th cycle to the 6th cycle is a lot of requirements that most government agencies didn't, really start realizing in the 5th planning cycle. Oh, we need to start collecting data on these things so that in the 6th cycle, we have our own local data to be able to, really ascertain, some of the information we're going to be asked to show the proof in the pudding in our final submittal of the 6th. You can't create data that does not exist. So that means we inevitably will have to have programs that collect that data and reassess it and address it during the planning cycle, which is one of the reasons why we inevitably have to have a housing manager here at the city in order to be able to work on that data, collect that data, and integrate it into our programs moving forward. And so I think that's probably going to be one of those things that to the public, it's looking, well, where are we doing this? Well, we can't just manifest data. Just fundamentally. So that's going to be a huge component. But we also, fundamentally, and this is where you do get a little bit of an insight of where the reviewers from the state are going with some of their comments, because they obviously don't give you any kind of opinions in the written formal letter. But when you are able to talk to them and you're asking them questions about, well, what do you mean we don't have that? Because it is in the element, and it's relatability of, okay, well, when they read the element, they weren't really able to easily find it, even if they eventually did find it later in the document. This needs to be a living, breathing document that helps individuals all through the community to be able to open it and be able to find the answer of what they're looking for. So if someone that's in the profession is struggling to find it, they want us to be able to make that more easily digestible for folks to be able to actually use that information in the future. So some of that is actually just relating some of the information we actually already had in the document. I would then say one of the bigger things that the jurisdiction, and it's not really a change, it's just really actually kind of putting our money where our mouth is almost, and really providing the firm commitments in our programs of saying, okay, we will do this by this year. We will change this component of the development standard to be this, and giving really measurable outcomes of exactly what we would see and achieve in our amendments to the zoning here in the city.
All right. Thank you, Nick. Marie.
Darn mute thing again. Okay, so since AFHH is the sticky wicket, apparently, the most difficult part, I wonder if you've thought of asking like the Chamber or the Downtown Village Association to set up meetings for you with some of the lower wage workers. And also, Jim put a comment in the chat about in reach to city staff who can't afford to live here. You may be one of them, Nick, I don't know. But so what about those things?
So one thing I will actually say, so prior to my arrival, when the interim director, Laura Simpson, was here, between John Bigg's retirement and my actual arrival here at the city, Laura Simpson actually did reach out to multiple of some of our businesses in downtown specifically, just because obviously relationship to City Hall, it's very easy to reach out to a lot of the service industry that's obviously in the downtown district. And the three that she reached out to, none of the service workers, so not the owners, not the managers, the people, you know, that are cooks, or the people that are cleaning rooms, or the people that, you know, are working in downtown, none of them actually wanted to come forward. And that's actually one of the things that sometimes is really hard, is when you're doing a big planning document like this, the silent majority doesn't want to contribute because of some of the bad years of what has been used with some of that data. And that's, you know, from, you know, you just look back at some very bad planning practices, not here in Los Altos specifically, by any means am I saying that, but in some other big jurisdictions of what they've used in order to do gentrification and kind of push some of the segments of community out with that data. And so a lot of individuals really are reluctant to want to contribute to some of that. However, when you have someone that's boots on the ground, not just asking to schedule an appointment or a meeting, and really kind of be able to go out there and have organic conversations with individuals slowly but surely, and have more of that kind of coordinator type, you know, facilitation, that really starts helping with the data component of being able to get some of the information from, you know, some of our lower income segments of the population. So I think that will be huge. And that's actually one of the ways that we're going to get some of that information finally. I think the component about talk to city staff, I know the numbers of what obviously wages are of our city staff. And that is a component of what some of the fundamentals of what, you know, is built into a lot of our programs is to be able to provide, you know, the multiple levels of affordability from the low to the moderate to the above moderate, because market rate is not attainable for 99% of city staff, at least in our jurisdiction. So that's inevitably something that isn't explicitly put in there in regards to the city staff, so that no one's, you know, named in that, because that's a little bit of a gray area. But it's overall in the back end of really what some of those programs and data inevitably does provide.
Great, thanks, Nick. Any more questions, please raise your hands. I'll take this opportunity just to give the updates before the next meeting, and I'll see if there are any more hands raised. So we're going to be taking a break over the holidays, and our next meeting will be on Friday, January 13th, 2023, from 8:30 to 9:30 as usual. We're thrilled to have our new mayor, Sally Meadows, join us for an event entitled What's Ahead for 2023 with Los Altos Mayor Sally Meadows. Should be a great event. And, as many of you know, she was sworn in as mayor this past week, and, a little celebration afterwards to welcome the new council. So it'd be great to hear from her and see what's on tap for the next year. If you'd like to be added to the mailing list, please email us at info@losaltoscommunitycoalition.org. Thank you, Kim, for pasting that in the chat. And a big thank you, as always, to the Los Altos Mountain View Community Foundation for providing LACC with financial and in-kind support. Thank you, Adine. As always, thanks to Larry Barron for everything he does to pull the videos together and get them up onto YouTube. So Janine, you did not disappoint. I knew you had another question, so go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Again, on AFFH. So Nick, I love your answer in the sense that AFFH is an iterative process. However, would it be possible to include some low-hanging fruit in the current revision, just so that we don't risk achieving or failing to achieve substantial compliance at the outset? And I know that you're going to have some meetings with some of us later today, and you'll see some of those low-hanging fruit that we suggest. But just as a general approach, are you against, or would you be willing to consider that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think especially if something to me, and again, I know I'm going to be meeting with 2 other groups today. So any more, feedback, especially things that are low hanging fruit. Even with staff, with stuff here in City Hall, if this is something easy that we can get someone out the door and kind of, have an easy win and success for something, like let's get that one done, or let's integrate that, let's do that so that we can then move on to the bigger things. Because then every little bit helps, I think. So definitely that's something, if you guys want to bring that up later, Janine, definitely, obviously let me, simmer on it a little bit more once we talk about it. But yeah, I think low-hanging fruit for anything that's going to be a positive addition to something for the housing element, I think should be welcomed, no matter who the director is or who's developing the program. It's something that we should try to accomplish as best as we can. But obviously I'll have to, simmer on it once we talk about it.
Great. All right, last call. We have a very quiet group this morning. I'm a little shocked, actually, but if no more questions, we'll wrap it up and wish everyone happy holidays. Any last ones? All right. Well, thank you all. Wish you the best over the holidays from all of us at LACC, and we'll look forward to seeing you in 2023. Nick, thank you so much for joining us today, for the great answers. Great job as always. Hope you don't lose your voice with your multiple meetings today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
Nick. Bye.
Thank you.